What I'd like to do in this presentation is to illustrate some of the management challenges and issues that we have in the conservation of coastal heritage sites in the care of Historic Environment Scotland, particularly in the light of challenges brought about by accelerating climate change, and to discuss some of the key approaches that are shaping our thinking in our management approach. Historic Environment Scotland is the Scottish Government's national heritage agency, and we directly manage over 300 sites of national or international importance across Scotland, and we're the largest operator of paid-for visitor attractions in the country. We're also responsible for the protection of historic places through designation and consents, and we're a funder delivering millions of pounds each year to promote research, conservation, and the sustainable development of the historic environment. A significant part of our role is the provision of advice and guidance to others for managing the historic environment, including the effects of climate change. Historic Environment Scotland and our predecessor organisations have long managed challenging coastal sites, and many of the historic monuments in state care have long histories of coastal defence. At some sites, existing physical defences, mostly sea walls, have been periodically repaired and maintained over time, and in some cases extended and rebuilt. Some of these date back to the first half of the 20th century, though most are likely to be from the 1950s onwards. A site such as this one at Broch of Bursay in Orkney has concrete defences that have been made to replicate the appearance of bedding in the local flagstones. You can see the grey colour of the concrete contrasting with the underlying brown sandstone. And this one at Midhow on the Orkney island of Rousey is a more modern wall that uses local flagstone, but in a different pattern that deliberately distinguishes it from the local geology. There's no doubt that our coastal sites are under increasing pressure and that erosive processes have increased in the last few decades. Some sites are requiring new types of intervention. For example, here at Castle Sween on the west coast of mainland Scotland, we've in the last few years undertaken rock stabilisation works to the natural bedrock foundations, which are becoming destabilised by coastal processes, in particular from storm events. The use of new technology is becoming increasingly important, in particular surveying and monitoring using UAV and laser scanning. For example, here at Newark Castle in Port Glasgow, protected by an extensive urban coastal seawall, and here laser scanned to identify cracks and defects and to monitor potential movements. One particular example of the use of laser scanning and other techniques is Skara Brae in Orkney, part of the Heart of Neolithic Orkney World Heritage Site, where the site is protected by a seawall and laser scanning is repeated every 2 years. The site was extensively excavated in the early 20th century, and coastal defences were constructed from that time onwards, requiring periodic repairs and expansion up to the present day. Only the small site itself is protected by the seawall, and the adjacent soft coastline is highly susceptible to erosion, seen here in the foreground. Over recent decades, works have been undertaken to extend the sides of the seawall and to deepen its footings. This has been effective, albeit with increasing frequency of works required. But it is the accelerating rate of loss of the adjacent soft coast that is primarily of concern. We've undertaken laser scanning every 2 years since 2010, and the comparative data shows a complex picture of varying accumulation and loss of material across the adjacent shore. Working closely with the Scotland's Dynamic Coast Project, we've been able to establish a much better understanding of the accelerating loss taking place in recent years. Faced with such issues as these, we're aware that a strategic approach is required, and given increasingly constrained resources, this inevitably means prioritization is needed. Key for this is evidence-based decision-making, and one of the most important factors is the availability of environmental and climate data. We're fortunate in the UK in that the Met Office produces climate projection data, much of which is available in scalable formats to provide information at local scales. And you can see on this graph sea level rise projected through this century for some of our key coastal sites around Scotland. In 2018, we published our first climate change risk assessment, for which we developed a methodology based on assessment of 6 different hazards, including coastal erosion, ground stability, and different types of flooding. With data obtained through collaboration with our Scottish Environmental Protection Agency and the British Geological Survey. The images seen here of Fort George in the northeast of Scotland, with the exposed northern side of the fort, shows risk of coastal erosion, seen here in the bottom right-hand image in the areas that are red, ties in with site observations, where these areas of loss of soft coastal materials is observed to be greatest. Here showing the progressive loss of soft shoreline adjacent to the historic structure, allowing us to focus our attention on particular parts of the site. In 2019, in Orkney, we trialled the Climate Vulnerability Index rapid assessment tool, which has been developed internationally for World Heritage sites, with Orkney being the first ever cultural World Heritage site to undergo the process. This methodology importantly goes beyond documenting the physical impacts of climate change to sites and also assesses the wider consequences, in particular economic, social, and community values. The identification of these key dependencies informs management planning and decision-making by providing a broader understanding of the consequences of the decisions we make. The link to our pilot CVI project is given on the slide, and further information is given on the CVI website web pages, also shown here. As a National Heritage Agency, we have a wider role beyond the heritage properties that are in state care, and that involves the provision of information and guidance to support managers of heritage assets across Scotland to assess climate change risks and to take actions. In 2019, we published this document, A Guide to Climate Change Impacts, which was developed by 14 organisations coming together under a climate change working group as part of the Scottish Government's Historic Environment Strategy. The purpose is to increase awareness and understanding of the impacts of climate change on our historic environment and to provide a practical guide highlighting the key issues related to different types of heritage assets. And through a series of thematic tables, support decision-making in terms of potential actions. The guide divides the historic environment into 7 distinct components, termed elements, and seen here top right, each presented as a series of illustrations through the guide, accompanied by detailed tables. Again, this guide is available online from our website. For the coastal part of the guide, the illustrative image you see here is the historic mining or quarrying village of Easdale, now a scheduled monument, and part of a series of small islands on the west coast of Scotland, which once exported roofing material around the globe. I don't have time to go into the details of the tables that are in the publication. I'm not sure how clear this image will be for you, but for each of the 7 elements, we describe exposure and vulnerability, highlighting issues such as the location and topography, with vulnerability being determined by factors such as the condition of the assets, the type of construction materials used, and the presence or otherwise of existing defences. The table offers guidance on adaptation actions, and this is divided into 2 sections, resistance and acceptance. You can see these on the right-hand side. This is an important distinction to make because we wanted to communicate that not all sites can be saved, and that where loss and damage is inevitable, then we need to attempt to manage that loss in a proactive way, but one which maximizes the benefits from that situation, no matter how undesirable. The actions described do not presume permanent hard coastal defences, but rather suggest strategies of undertaking risk assessments, monitoring and planning in order to consider the best course of action going forward. Some adaptation actions are described which increase resilience, with an emphasis on repair and maintenance, and also consideration of a particular site within a larger context. So, for example, wider programs of coastal management, such as dune stabilization or salt marsh restoration, and the incorporation of cultural assets within natural heritage considerations. Under the term acceptance, we've highlighted ways of maximizing the benefits of assets to communities and others in the face of their inevitable deterioration or loss, including managing the loss in a proactive way through the recording of sites using different means such as laser scanning or perhaps excavation, and the setting up where appropriate of responsive recording and recovery, including cleanup and temporary stabilization works following extreme weather events, is also described. Some options might consider relocation, and another important aspect is ensuring the ongoing engagement with local communities and others through the retention of physical artifacts and also digital assets such as 3D models, particularly in the face of loss. A final example shows the possibility of maximizing the opportunity of loss of sites. And that is from Links of Notland on the island of Westray in the Orkneys. Here, the loss of a fragile and exposed archaeological site was managed through a process of excavations and recovery over several years, accompanied by laser scanning at different stages of the excavations in order to create a digital view of the site in its entirety, obtained by digitally compiling a range of different 3D data sets from the different excavations. This approach has also resulted in increased knowledge through the recovery of numerous artifacts, much now held in the local community heritage centre, and the site has been replanted with dune grasses, which are resulting in some degree of stabilisation. Well, my time is up, and I hope I've been able to outline our work in Scotland through developing a strategic approach in terms of increasing awareness and developing methodologies and guidance, and the use of technologies to support evidence-based decisions based on sound environmental data. Lastly, is the stimulation of conversations that where we do not have the resources or the ability to resist or to save everything we would like. And it's important to accept the inevitability of loss in some cases, and to develop an approach of acceptance that proactively manages the loss of heritage whilst maximising the value and benefits of the process.